My name is Henry, and if you told me 5 years ago that I'd be the one balancing a career and parenting full-time, I probably wouldn't have believed you. Yet, here I am, working from home while raising 2 wonderful kids. Emily, who's 12, and Michael, who's 9. My wife, Sarah, has a demanding job at a marketing agency that keeps her traveling frequently, so I've taken on the role of both dad and household manager. Our home is in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where kids ride their bikes freely, and neighbors wave as they walk their dogs. It's a spacious house with enough room for the kids to have their own space and for me to set up a comfortable home office. The backyard is my favorite part of the house, with its lush garden, a sparkling swimming pool, and a patio where we often have family dinners when Sarah is home. Most mornings start the same way. I wake up early to pack lunches, make breakfast, and ensure the kids are ready for school. Emily is fiercely independent and barely needs a nudge to get moving, while Michael is a different story. He drags his feet, grumbling about wanting just 5 more minutes of sleep. Once they're out the door, I sit down at my desk, sipping coffee as I dive into emails and video calls. Balancing work and parenting isn't always easy, but I've learned to find a rhythm that works. When Sarah is home, she brings a whirlwind of energy. She loves to share stories from her business trips, meetings with high-profile clients, brainstorming sessions that run late into the night, and the occasional luxurious dinner in a fancy city restaurant. The kids adore her, hanging on to every word when she talks about the places she's visited. But those moments feel fleeting, as her job often calls her away before we've had a chance to fully settle back into a routine. Despite the demands of her career, Sarah is deeply committed to providing for our family. She's worked hard to reach her position, and I admire her drive and determination. At the same time, her frequent absences have created a dynamic where the kids rely on me for almost everything, from helping with homework to cheering them on at soccer games and school recitals. In the evenings, the house comes alive with the sounds of homework, dinner preparations, and the occasional sibling squabble. Emily is already showing signs of being a strong-willed teenager, while Michael is still my little adventurer, always asking questions about how things work or dreaming up stories about far-off places. I cherish these moments, even when the chaos feels overwhelming. When Sarah is gone on business trips, the house feels quieter. I try to keep things lively for the kids, organizing movie nights or letting them invite friends over to swim in the pool. They miss their mom, of course, but they've grown used to her schedule. It's become our normal, though there are times when I wonder if it's a little too normal, if we've all adapted too well to the gaps her job creates. Life in our home is busy, full of love, and sometimes a little messy. It's not perfect, but it's ours. For now, I'm just trying to keep everything balanced, one day at a time. Sarah called me late one evening while she was away on a business trip. Her voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of frustration as she explained what had happened. "My wallet was stolen," she said, "at the hotel. It's such a mess, Henry. I've already canceled the cards, but I need to deal with replacing my ID when I get back." I assured her that everything would be fine, that these things happen, and that she just needed to focus on getting through her trip. She thanked me and hung up, but something about the conversation lingered in my mind. Sarah wasn't the type to misplace things or let her guard down, especially not when she traveled. Still, I brushed it off. Everyone has an off day. A few days later, while tidying up the house, I came across a stack of papers on Sarah's desk. Among them was a statement for her inheritance account. It wasn't unusual for us to have separate finances for personal use. Sarah had inherited a modest sum from her grandmother years ago, and she'd always kept it separate from our shared accounts. What caught my attention wasn't the account itself, but a transaction listed on the statement. A check for $7,500 made out to a jewelry store. My first reaction was confusion. Sarah and I weren't big on extravagant gifts, and $7,500 was far more than she would normally spend on anything. I racked my brain, trying to recall if she'd mentioned buying something recently, but nothing came to mind. Was it a gift for someone? An investment piece? Or something else entirely? The timing struck me as odd too. The check was dated just a few days before her wallet was supposedly stolen. A gnawing feeling started to grow in my stomach. Could the two things be connected? And why hadn't she mentioned such a significant purchase? I debated whether to bring it up with her, but something held me back. Maybe it was the thought that I was overreacting, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Or maybe it was a quiet voice in the back of my mind, telling me that if I pushed too hard, I might not like the answers I'd get. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the unease. The $7,500 check to a jewelry store felt out of character, and the stolen wallet story suddenly seemed less straightforward. I told myself to let it go, that Sarah would explain everything when the time was right. But deep down, I knew this wasn't something I could ignore. It was the kind of detail that burrows into your thoughts, refusing to let go until you uncover the truth. The uneasy feeling from the inheritance account transaction didn't go away. Days turned into restless nights, my thoughts spiraling around the unanswered questions. I decided I couldn't let it sit any longer. The curiosity, or maybe the gnawing doubt, drove me to act. One morning, after dropping the kids off at school, I finally picked up the phone and called the jewelry store listed on the account statement. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but the answer I received left me speechless. After verifying some basic details, the store clerk cheerfully explained, "Oh yes, Mrs. Sarah purchased a set of custom wedding rings. A lovely pair." She mentioned replacing a lost set. Such a thoughtful gesture. Custom wedding rings? Lost set? My mind reeled as I thanked the clerk and hung up. Sarah had never mentioned losing our wedding rings. In fact, her original ring sat untouched in the jewelry box on her dresser. I'd seen it just last week. I stood in the kitchen, phone still in hand, trying to process what I just learned. Wedding rings were deeply symbolic, and Sarah knew that. Why would she buy a new set? And more importantly, why hadn't she told me? The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't concentrate on work, distracted by the mounting evidence that something wasn't right. When Sarah returned from her business trip that evening, she was her usual cheerful self, recounting her meetings and travel mishaps. I listened, nodding at the appropriate moments, all the while wondering what secrets she was keeping. Later that night, when Sarah was in the shower, I noticed her briefcase sitting near the couch. It wasn't like me to snoop, but something compelled me to look. My hands trembled slightly as I unclasped it and opened the top flap. Inside, among the usual files and work notes, was an open package of contraceptives. The kind we hadn't used in years, not since deciding we were happy with 2 kids. My heart sank. There was no plausible explanation for why she'd have them, not when we hadn't needed them for so long. The sight of the package confirmed what I had been dreading. Sarah wasn't just hiding something. She was betraying me. I closed the briefcase carefully, ensuring everything was exactly as I'd found it. Then I sat down, trying to steady my breathing. The evidence was overwhelming. A stolen wallet, a $7,500 purchase of wedding rings, and now this. It all pointed to the same devastating conclusion. That night, as Sarah slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with questions. Who was she seeing? How long had this been going on? And why would she risk everything we had built together? I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing. I couldn't ignore this any longer. The life I thought we had was a lie, and it was time to confront the truth. The discovery of the contraceptives in Sarah's briefcase was the final push I needed. The doubts and suspicions had grown too large to ignore. I couldn't confront her without solid proof, and I didn't want to make accusations that she could twist or deny. I needed irrefutable evidence, and for that, I turned to a professional. I hired a private investigator named Mark, a man with a reputation for discretion and thoroughness. When we met, I laid out everything. The stolen wallet story, the mysterious purchase of wedding rings, and the contraceptives. Mark listened attentively, nodding as he took notes. "When's her next trip?" he asked, his tone matter-of-fact. "Next week. She's heading to Houston for 3 days." "That's plenty of time," he said. "I'll track her movements, document everything, and let you know what I find." I felt a strange mix of guilt and determination as I handed over the details of Sarah's itinerary. This wasn't how I'd envisioned our marriage turning out, but I couldn't let my emotions cloud the truth any longer. The days leading up to her trip were tense. Sarah went about her usual routine, completely unaware that I was watching her every move more closely than ever. When she kissed me goodbye and left for the airport, I felt a pang of sadness, but also a grim resolve. This was the moment of truth. Mark kept me updated over the course of the trip. His first report came the night Sarah arrived in Houston. She checked into the hotel around 6 p.m., he told me over the phone. An hour later, she left and met a man at a nearby restaurant. They had dinner, then returned to the hotel together. I clenched my fists as I listened, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you get photos?" "Everything's documented," Mark assured me. "I'll send you the report with pictures at the end of the trip." Over the next 2 days, the pattern repeated. Sarah spent her days at work meetings, but her evenings were another story. She met with different men each night, sometimes at restaurants, other times directly in her hotel room. Mark's updates were concise and factual, but each one felt like a punch to the gut. By the time Sarah returned home, I had the full report in my hands. Mark had compiled everything: timestamps, photos, and detailed accounts of her movements. There was no ambiguity. The pictures were damning. Sarah sitting across from one man at dinner, leaning in close and laughing. Another man entering her hotel room late at night and leaving hours later. I stared at the photos for what felt like hours, the weight of the betrayal sinking deeper with each passing moment. She hadn't just betrayed me. She'd betrayed our family, our life together, and everything we'd built. When Sarah walked through the door that evening, smiling and chatting about her trip, I could barely look at her. My mind was racing, but I knew I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I decided how to handle what came next. I had the evidence. Now it was time to figure out what to do with it. The days after Sarah returned from Houston were some of the hardest of my life. I had everything I needed: the photos, the timeline, and the undeniable truth. Still, the decision to file for divorce wasn't easy. Despite the betrayal, this was the woman I had shared years of my life with, the mother of my children. But I couldn't ignore what she'd done, nor could I allow her actions to continue tearing apart our family. I reached out to a divorce attorney the day after Sarah came back. Sitting in that office, I explained everything: the evidence of her infidelity, the growing distance in our marriage, and my desire to protect Emily and Michael from the fallout. The attorney was sympathetic but direct. "You're in a strong position," she said. "The evidence you've gathered will weigh heavily in your favor, especially regarding custody. If you're ready to proceed, we can file immediately." I nodded, my resolve solidifying. "I'm ready." The paperwork was filed within days. When Sarah was served, her reaction was exactly what I'd expected: shock, anger, and then denial. She stormed into the house, waving the papers in her hand. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "You're divorcing me? Henry, we can work through this." I looked at her, calm but resolute. "Work through what, Sarah? The lies? The cheating? The nights you spent with other men while I was here raising our kids? There's nothing left to work through." She froze, her face pale. You know?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I know everything. I hired a private investigator. I've seen the photos, read the reports. You've betrayed me, Sarah, and I won't let you destroy what's left of this family." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But then, to my surprise, she broke down in tears. "It's not what you think," she sobbed. "I've been struggling, Henry, with everything. The stress of work, the pressure to keep up appearances. I started drinking more on trips, taking pills to get through the day. It spiraled out of control, and I didn't know how to stop. I felt a pang of sadness, but it was overshadowed by the weight of her betrayal. You could have talked to me, Sarah. You could have told me you were struggling. Instead, you lied, you cheated, and you destroyed everything we had." She wiped her tears, her voice desperate. "I'll change. I'll go to therapy, rehab if I need to. Just don't do this, Henry. Don't take the kids away from me." But I'd already made up my mind. This isn't about punishment, Sarah. It's about doing what's best for Emily and Michael. They deserve stability, and right now you can't provide that. She flinched, the weight of my words hitting her like a physical blow. "I can't lose them," she whispered. "I can't lose you. You already have," I said quietly. "You made your choices, Sarah. Now you have to live with them." In the following weeks, the legal process moved forward. My attorney requested full custody of the children, citing Sarah's infidelity and her admission of substance abuse. The evidence was irrefutable, and the court sided with me, granting me temporary custody while Sarah was required to attend therapy and substance abuse counseling. I asked Sarah to leave the house, not as a punishment, but as a step toward creating a stable environment for the kids. She moved out reluctantly, her once proud demeanor replaced by a shadow of regret and defeat. As I watched her drive away, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a sense of finality. This wasn't the ending I had envisioned for our family, but it was the one I had to accept. For Emily, for Michael, and for myself, it was time to move forward. There was no saving the marriage, but there was still a chance to rebuild a life worth living. In the months following the divorce, life took on a bittersweet rhythm. I poured my energy into creating a stable, loving environment for Emily and Michael, ensuring that the turbulence of the past didn't overshadow their childhood. It wasn't easy, but every smile, every laugh, every ordinary moment spent with them reminded me why I made the choices I did. Sarah, on the other hand, went in the opposite direction. Without the structure of family life or the stability of our home, she seemed to spiral further out of control. I would occasionally hear about her through mutual acquaintances or catch glimpses of her life on social media. Pictures of her at clubs, surrounded by strangers, holding a drink in one hand and wearing a vacant, forced smile, started to surface. She missed scheduled visitations with the kids more often than not, and when she did show up, she looked worn out, her eyes dull, her movements sluggish. It hurt to see the woman I once loved fall so far, but I knew there was nothing more I could do for her. Sarah had chosen her path, and now she was living the consequences. Through it all, my priority remained the kids. Emily was navigating the tricky waters of adolescence, and Michael's boundless curiosity kept me on my toes. They both adapted well to our new normal, though I could see the sadness in their eyes whenever Sarah disappointed them. I did my best to shield them from her choices, reminding them that they were loved and safe, no matter what. It was during this time that I met Rachel. Our paths crossed at a local community event for single parents, a space where people could connect and share their experiences. Rachel was a divorced mother of one, her son, Tyler, just a year older than Michael. She had an easy smile, a calm presence, and a warmth that drew me in almost immediately. Over coffee one afternoon, Rachel opened up about her own past. Her ex-husband's infidelity had left her shattered, much like Sarah's betrayal had done to me. But rather than letting it define her, Rachel had rebuilt her life with quiet strength and determination. We bonded over shared stories of hurt and resilience, finding comfort in each other's understanding. What began as casual conversations over coffee turned into dinners, outings with the kids, and eventually something deeper. Rachel wasn't just a breath of fresh air. She was a reminder that love and trust could exist after betrayal. As the weeks turned into months, Rachel and I grew closer. Our families began to blend in small but meaningful ways. Tyler and Michael became fast friends, and Emily found a confidant in Rachel, someone who could offer advice without the complicated weight of being her mother. Rachel's presence brought a sense of balance to my life that I hadn't realized was missing. She didn't try to replace Sarah or erase the past. Instead, she stood beside me, helping me navigate the challenges of moving forward. Sarah's visits became less and less frequent, her chaotic lifestyle consuming more of her time. The kids stopped asking about her as often, focusing instead on the growing sense of stability in our lives. I tried to keep the door open for her, hoping she might find her way back to being the mother they needed. But as the years went on, it became clear that her priorities lay elsewhere. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Rachel and I weren't just building a relationship. We were building a family, one rooted in honesty, understanding, and mutual respect. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The scars from the past hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined me. What Sarah had torn apart, Rachel had helped me rebuild. And for that, I would always be grateful. 3 years had passed since the divorce, and my life had settled into a rhythm I never thought I'd achieve after all that had happened. Rachel and I had built something strong together. A home filled with laughter, trust, and a sense of stability that had been missing for so long. Emily and Michael were thriving, their lives full of joy and new experiences. I rarely thought of Sarah anymore, except in passing, as a distant memory of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. That morning started like any other. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of fallen leaves. After dropping the kids at school, I stopped by a small cafe near the office for breakfast. It was a cozy place I frequented often, known for its fresh croissants and strong coffee. The sunlight streaming through the windows bathed everything in a warm glow, and the chatter of customers inside created a comforting hum. Coffee in hand, I stepped outside, taking in the quiet bustle of the morning. As I headed toward my car, my eyes landed on a figure sitting on a bench near the cafe entrance. At first, I didn't recognize her. She was hunched over, her body language closed off, almost defensive, as though she was trying to disappear. Her coat looked too thin for the weather, and her hair, once meticulously styled, was now a lifeless mess, streaked with gray and tied back in a loose, careless ponytail. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat as realization dawned. It was Sarah. I hadn't seen her since the court proceedings, and the woman sitting before me barely resembled the confident, put-together person I once knew. Her face was gaunt, with deep lines around her mouth and eyes that made her look much older than her age. Dark circles hung under her hollow eyes, which stared blankly at the pavement. She was holding a cigarette in trembling fingers, taking slow, deliberate drags as though it were the only thing anchoring her to the moment. Beside her on the bench was a half-empty cup of coffee and a handbag that looked worn and battered, as if it had been through years of neglect. For a moment, I simply stood there, frozen, unsure of how to process what I was seeing. This wasn't the Sarah I remembered. The woman who used to stride into a room with an air of confidence, her laughter infectious and her presence commanding, was gone. In her place was someone who looked utterly lost, beaten down by life and perhaps her own choices. I debated turning away, walking to my car, and pretending I hadn't seen her, but something rooted me to the spot. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or perhaps it was the need to see the end result of everything she had done. As if sensing someone's gaze, she looked up, her hollow eyes meeting mine. For a moment, confusion flickered across her face, followed by recognition and, finally, shame. She quickly stubbed out the cigarette, fumbling awkwardly as though embarrassed to be caught in such a state. "Henry," she muttered, her voice barely audible and hoarse, either from the cigarette or from years of shouting into the void of a chaotic life. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. Seeing her like this wasn't satisfying, nor was it the vindication I once thought I might feel. It was just sad, tragic even. "Sarah," I replied finally, my tone neutral. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no words came. Her lips trembled slightly before she looked away, her hands fidgeting with the cup of coffee beside her. There was no anger in her expression, no pride, no attempt to justify or explain. Only shame and exhaustion. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. I could see her wrestling with herself, trying to decide whether to say something or simply leave. Finally, she stood, clutching her bag and coffee cup, her movements unsteady. "Take care," she mumbled, her voice so quiet I barely heard her. Without waiting for a reply, she hurried away, her shoulders hunched as though trying to shield herself from the weight of the world, or perhaps from the weight of her own choices. I watched her walk down the street, her steps uneven, her posture sagging under an invisible burden. She disappeared around the corner, leaving a void in her wake. I stood there for a long moment, processing what I'd just seen. This wasn't the Sarah I had married, the vibrant woman I had once loved. This was someone else entirely, someone shaped by years of poor choices and the fallout of her own actions. The glamorous facade she had once cultivated was gone, stripped away to reveal the emptiness beneath. A mix of emotions swirled inside me. Shock, pity, and, if I was honest, a cold sense of acceptance. This was what her life had become. I thought back to the nights I'd spent awake, wondering if I'd made the right decisions, doubting myself and the choices I'd made after the divorce. But seeing her like this, I knew deep down that this was the result of her actions, not mine. She had betrayed me, our family, and herself. She had thrown away the life we built together for fleeting thrills and shallow distractions. Now she was paying the price. As I walked to my car, I felt a strange sense of closure. I hadn't expected this encounter, but in a way, it gave me the final confirmation I needed to move forward without looking back. Sarah was a ghost from a life I no longer lived, a reminder of how far I'd come, and how far she had fallen. Deep down, I knew she deserved it, not out of spite or malice, but because life has a way of balancing the scales. This was hers, and now I could let go completely,